All right, so hello again. I put up a video a few days ago, probably about a week ago, responding to a comment that had been left on my YouTube channel that disappeared immediately after it showed up. So I got a notification. I read the first few lines and then I couldn't find the comment. So the person who left the comment apparently came back and posted the comment again. And most of the stuff that's here, I've already addressed in my previous video, but I'm just going to read through it and say a few things about it as well. Okay, so it says, hello, Pastor Mona. I believed it was my comment which was misplaced and to which you are referring. I will here post it again with a little more, again and a little more. The victory of the final generation has nothing to do with co-redemption. It has everything to do with demonstrating Christ's completed atonement. Like Job, Christ uses his final generation through the final test and under the most adverse circumstances with no mediation for sin in the sanctuary above to show that the keeping power of the gospel is strong enough to secure the universe through eternal ages. The problem with the anti-LGBT folks is that they magnify the human element and believe that since the final demonstration of righteousness of Christ in humanity has a human element to it, that the whole concept must be co-redemption. But the whole objective of the cross and the gospel is to redeem humans from sin in this present evil world. So how strange that anti-LGBT folks would fight against the very objective of the gospel that Christ is working to accomplish in preparation for the final conflict before he returns. The fact that Christ's redeeming power is on display in the last great crisis and that this last great conflict has eternal consequences is very plain by this statement. He, Satan, numbers the world as his subjects, but the little company who keep the commandments of God are resisting his supremacy. If he could blot them out from the earth, his triumph would be complete. Great Controversy 6:18. So it is clear that God's faithful people on the earth during the final conflict are keeping Satan from claiming uncontested supremacy over the earth and thereby triumphing. Through God's faithful people in the last great test and conflict, Christ once again triumphs over Satan and his followers, but not as a method of redeeming or securing the universe, but as a revelation that God's people have been redeemed and that the universe is secure. Okay, so let's go back and read this. There's only so much I can do with stuff like this because this is not really saying something meaningful. Like, in other words, basically, in theology, theology attempts to be very precise. So when somebody that is trained in theology tries to explain something, they say certain things in such a way so that people understand exactly what they mean by those statements. And then they can say, okay, I agree, I disagree, and here are the reasons why I agree or disagree. But a lot of the stuff that I read here, it could be interpreted in so many different ways. I'm not totally sure what exactly it means and why things have to be the way they're said. So there's only so much I can comment on this. But let's go through it step by step from the beginning. It says the victory of final generation has nothing to do with co-redemption. It has everything to do with demonstrating Christ's completed atonement. So a question I would have for this is, why exactly does that demonstration need to take place? Why do we need such a demonstration? The idea is here that somehow whatever Jesus accomplished from the time of the cross and up to the present began some kind of process of separating sin from humanity, and it needs to be demonstrated that the separation actually succeeded and it's finally complete before the great controversy could be over, or something to that effect. But it's not clear exactly what that means and why any of this stuff needs to happen. So here's the question I have. And the thing is, depending on who you're talking to, they might have very different reasons for this. So I'm kind of guessing in the dark here. But somebody, and people I've talked to in the past, would say, well, the reason this to happen is because intelligent beings from other universes, like the angels and other created beings from other planets or other universes or wherever they are, that haven't fallen into sin, before they allow human beings to enter heaven, they need some kind of assurance that the atonement process was successful and that human beings can be trusted. But here's the question. how do we know as human beings that the unfallen people from other universes can be trusted? How do we know that they won't start another rebellion? Now, these are people or individuals, including the unfallen angels. All these individuals have been there from the beginning. They were there when Satan started the great controversy. They were there when one third of the angels left alongside Satan. They were there when Adam and Eve fell, and they've been there ever since. And this whole time, they made a choice not to side with Satan. But how do we know that that's guaranteed to stay the same for the rest of eternity? Now, here's a way to ask that question. What if unfallen angels or people from other universes, what if they had come and got incarnated on earth the way Jesus had? And what if they had to face all, all that Satan had to throw at them, the way last generation theology proponents are saying the 144,000 will have to do after the close of probation? Would they be successful? I mean, do we know for sure that if they were put in that scenario at the end of time, when the probation is closed and basically any kind of sin you commit, it's over, it's done for, and you lose, and they have to live without sin for an extended amount of time, and they have Satan coming at them the way he came at Jesus throughout his entire life on earth. How do we know all the angels in heaven and all the unfallen beings that have never committed sin up to this time, how do we know they would survive? I mean, they've never had to live life in a world where, they have to, you know, they have to get hungry. They have to get tired. They have, if they don't eat and they don't sleep for several days in a row, they become irritated. And it's so much easier to fall into sin and all this stuff. And then to have Satan follow you around the way he followed Jesus around and constantly put stumbling blocks before you, and then to have the death decree and all this other stuff that is supposed to happen in the last days. How do we know they would manage to make it through that situation? And if we don't have the guarantee, how do we know that they won't sin at some point in the future, even though they haven't sinned up to this point? In other words, the question here is, who came up with this idea that there has to be some kind of demonstration that, like it says over here, the victory of the final generation has nothing to do with co-redemption. It has everything to do with the demonstration of Christ's completed atonement. Why is there such a demonstration needed? And if it's needed with the 144,000 at the end, why isn't it needed with like the millions of other people that have died in the past and are still going to go to heaven? And why isn't it needed for the angels and for the beings that have never fallen? Somehow it's just needed with this one group of people at the end of time. We don't know that any of the unfallen beings would make it through that time at the end. Just because they've never fallen in heaven under pristine conditions where there is no temptation, there is no real sin, there is no, anyway, the additional thing that I even forgot to mention is the fallen human flesh. So imagine that these beings are incarnated, not in their present sinless condition, but they're incarnated in fallen human flesh. And they have temptations coming from inside, not just from the outside, like LGTR say about Christ. So would the angels survive this? Would the unfallen beings survive this? We don't know. I mean, obviously all this stuff is speculation, but the whole point is that the entire thing is speculation. This whole idea of a demonstration at the end of time. Why is that needed? What is it going to accomplish? What is it going to prove? I don't know. Nobody seems to know because nobody takes the time to think about this stuff, because this entire movement is made of people that sort of like take only a little bit of time to think of their stuff, and then they stop thinking and they say, okay, I'm not going to ask any more questions because I don't want to fall into doubt. It's kind of like the evangelicals. You try to have a conversation with them about hell, and you say like, hey, I know you believe in hell, but here's another way to interpret some of the scriptures, and there's a better way to understand things. And they stop listening to you because they're scared that if they open up their mind just a little bit to consider the possibility that hell is not the way they've always learned it is, that they might end up going to hell and burning forever. And the fear and the superstition of it all prevents them from actually thinking through the whole thing and realizing it's not even a biblical doctrine. And it's basically what happens with a lot of volunteers when it comes to some of their stuff. They don't take the time to think through it to try to figure out what how much sense does any of this stuff make, because they're afraid they're going to be like led astray or whatever. And unfortunately, nobody has any answers on any of this stuff. Okay, so let's go on. It talks about Job, and I don't know if what's on many LGTers' mind. I know that I've kind of gone through a phase decades ago when I used to think that a lot was resting on the line in the time of Job. I don't know if that's the case exactly. Anyway, that there's a lot to be taken from the book of Job in the Bible, but I'm not sure uh, things could be taken from that book to the level that LGTers try to take it. So anyway, maybe that's a point for another time. Okay, so then it says to show that the keeping power of the gospel is strong enough to secure the universal eternal ages. Again, the same issues that I just brought up. The problem with anti-LGBT folks is that they magnify the human element and believe that as the final demonstration of the righteousness of Christ in humanity has a human element to it, that the whole concept must be called redemption. It's not anti-LGBT folks that magnify the human element, it's the LGBT folks that do it. And here's why. Okay, so let's think about the reasoning process of last generation theology people when it comes to what it takes to win the great controversy and to secure the universe. It starts with Jesus. So Jesus comes and takes on human nature, takes on himself human nature, but it's a certain type of human nature. It's fallen human nature, and he takes it on, and he goes through 30 some years on this planet where God allows him to be faced with the same temptations that all of us human beings are faced with. And then for the last 3.5 years of his life, he's faced with additional things that most of us don't ever face, or he's put in situations that are so extreme so that he has an experience similar to the experience of some of the most fallen people in humanity. So if you can think of the drug addict who's essentially been an addict his whole life, and the battle that such an individual has to face. And if you could think of people that have other types of weaknesses and difficulties, Jesus is put in several situations in the wilderness. You know, he ends up having to go for 30 days without eating, and he's brought to the very edge of his human nature, where, you know, maybe if the angels hadn't come to help him out, if another few hours passed, he would probably die of hunger. And yet he still manages to overcome. So Jesus is put through these situations and brought as closely as possible to human beings in our struggles. And the way he overcomes is not in any power that he has in himself. It's not in any power that he brings to the table by the fact that he's a divine being. Okay, so if you say, well, sure, Jesus overcame because he had a different nature. He had an unfallen nature. Somebody would argue that, and an LGBT would say, no, he had a fallen nature just like us. And then somebody would say, well, yeah, but he was divine. And then the LGBT would say, no, it's not because of his divine nature that he managed to overcome sin. It's because he surrendered moment by moment and gave himself over to the Holy Spirit. And it is by that surrender that he overcame sin. And so you say, okay, so is this a big deal? Is what Jesus accomplished a big deal? Well, of course it's a big deal. He managed to take on Satan and defeat him in his home turf, so to speak, by just simple moment by moment surrender. Okay, so Jesus accomplished a tremendous thing in being willing to come and take on flesh and live this life and surrender to God every moment and overcome Satan in this way. So then we skip forward 2,000 years to the end of time. And what are the 144,000 going to do? Well, it's the exact same thing. There is no level to which they can be any different than Christ. Because if you say, well, God sort of gave them the victory or something like that. Well, does that mean that God predestined them, like the Calvinists would say, or does that mean that they were sort of possessed by the Holy Spirit the way like a demon-possessed person is possessed and does things that they don't want to do? No, it can't be that. It has to be a willful surrender, just like what Jesus was doing, because otherwise it wouldn't prove anything. I mean, obviously God is powerful enough to possess the person and make them do things they don't want to do. That doesn't prove anything in the great controversy. So no, the last generation, the 144,000, they would have to essentially tackle things in the same way that Jesus did, by moment surrender. Uh, so essentially, like in every respect, what those people do at the end has to be pretty much the exact same thing that Jesus was doing. He was doing it not through his own strength, but through the strength of the Spirit. They would have to do it not in their strength, but in the strength of the Spirit. And the victory will be God's because it will be God doing it in them. But the victory was God's when it came to Jesus as well, because God was doing the victory in him on earth as well. And yet, what Jesus did is a major accomplishment. We look back and we glorify God because of that victory that he accomplished in the flesh, even though he was doing it through God's strength, but he still had to do that moment by moment surrender. So, just logically speaking, you have to apply that to the 144,000 as well. So, where it says anti-LGBT folks here, is that they magnify the human element? No, the LGBT folks magnify the human element. You guys are the ones that are saying these people at the end of time are doing pretty much the exact same thing that Jesus did. How else can we interpret what you're saying? That's what you're saying. And because of that, you're kind of forced into this situation. Anyway, this quote right here, I'm not really sure how it applies to any of this stuff. What else? I don't know if there's anything else I want to comment on here. The whole objective here, this is another line. The whole objective of the cross and the gospel is to redeem humans from sin in the present evil world. The thing is this, the objective of the gospel is to redeem humans from sin now, but it's in order to make it possible for us to live sinless lives in the new world. It's not for this world in other words, the point of it all is not so that we would continue to live in a world of sin for eternity and live perfect lives. That's not what God is doing. He's doing this whole thing so that when the great controversy is over, we're going to be able to live for the rest of eternity without turning back into sin. And just like the beings that have never fallen and the unfallen angels, we're going to continue living that life and never wanting to do this sin experiment again. The point of the great controversy isn't to keep us in a world of sin living perfect lives. Okay, it's for us to live perfect lives in a new body throughout eternity in a world without temptation. And the only way temptation could come up again is if it comes up inside of us the way it did with Lucifer originally, right? So because of this, God is able to save people all throughout human history, even though they never reached that level of perfection that LGTers talk about. Because the point isn't that they're going to have to live perfect lives on earth in a simple environment. All right, so anyway, these are some things that I have to comment on this passage or this comment that was left here. Let me read this last line. Through God's faithful people of the last great test, Christ once again triumphs over Satan and his followers, but not as a method of redeeming securing the universe, but as a revelation that God's people have been redeemed and the universe secured. Anyway, it's basically the same, making the same statement that he was making originally. And the question is, why is this demonstration needed? And if this demonstration is needed, why aren't there a bunch of other demonstrations that are needed as well? Like I mentioned, there's so many other things that seems like they should be demonstrated if such a thing was really needed. Anyway, the point of my initial videos and what I said before is that honestly, a lot of this stuff doesn't matter anyway, because my contention goes back to the time of Andreasen. So Andreasen, he started off dealing with a specific problem, and he produced a very specific solution. So essentially, it's like you go to your math class at school, and the teacher puts a problem on the board, x plus 3 equals 7, right? It's a very specific problem, and it has a specific solution. It's not some random thing that you could come up with your own. Like you go to English class and they read a story and somebody has one interpretation, somebody else has a different interpretation. It's not that kind of thing. In math, there's one solution. X plus 3 equals 7, then X is a certain answer, and that's it. Andreessen was dealing with a specific problem, and he came up with a solution. And what I'm saying is that that specific solution doesn't solve that specific problem. Why? Because if you go all the way back to the beginning of the universe, either God needs a situation where both Jesus and the 144,000 have to accomplish something to redeem the universe from sin, in which case, by definition, that's for redemption, or he doesn't need this. And if he doesn't need this, Andreessen's thing falls apart because he no longer has an explanation for the delay. And Andreessen's whole thing was trying to explain the delay. Why was there a delay taking us to 1844 and another delay from 1844 on, why the pioneers have died and Jesus still hadn't come? And Andreessen's explanation doesn't work either this way or that way. If both things are needed, that's for redemption, and that's a heresy. If they're both not needed, then you cannot explain the delay in a way that absolves God of being responsible for the delay, because that's what Andreessen was trying to do. He was trying to, on the one hand, explain or safeguard Adventist theology, but at the same time, find a way to explain that did not put on God the blame for the delay. And his particular explanation doesn't work. It doesn't work no matter how you twist it. And I don't care if people after Andreessen try to come up with other ways of looking at the thing, because the issue is he has a specific problem and his solution doesn't work with that problem. And the reason it matters is because the guy started this whole conspiracy around the QOD stuff based on his whole theology that ended up splitting the church. And we have 60 years of a cultural split that has gotten to the place that it's unfixable, because people, regardless of whether they agree or not with the various theologies in the church, they have this, they're pressured to go along with this stuff because otherwise they don't have a way to stay in office, to move up the corporate ladder, so to speak, because they need the support of people on either side of the issue. So Andreessen, even though he never intended to do this, and the poor guy did the best he could, unfortunately, like, he made a lot of mistakes, he created a situation that has put the church in a thing that there's no way out of it, and we're stuck as a church. And incidentally, if there is a reason for a delay, that's the reason for the delay. Jesus cannot accomplish the work he set out to accomplish with the church if the church is perpetually split in half. If we're constantly working in opposite directions, we're never going to finish the work that we were given to do. So ironically, the very guy who came up with this thing about the delay and trying to convince people to hasten Christ's coming, and everybody after him, including Preby and who else? Kirkpatrick and a dozen other, Kevin Paulson, all these guys, all these people that are constantly promoting the LGBT stuff, trying to convince people to hasten Christ's coming and to put an end to the delay by accepting supposedly authentic Adventist theology. They're the ones that have delayed Christ's coming more than probably anybody else in the history of Adventism. Starting with Andreessen, who began the whole thing, and then everybody else after him. They've created a situation in the church that essentially has created an endless split. And unless some kind of miracle happens, it's never going to get fixed, because the LGBT side of it, they're never going to admit their mistake or admit the mistake of their founder. And everybody else is never going to go along with their stuff because it doesn't make any sense. And we're stuck. And we're stuck in it, not just theoretically, like in terms of our theology, but we're stuck in a situation politically and in pretty much every other respect. So that's what I'm concerned with. If somebody comes around and says, well, here's my version of LGBT and my version of LGBT doesn't have the problem you mentioned, I don't care about that. Have whatever version you want. I'm concerned about this stuff that has global ramifications. That's my whole thing with this theology. So anyway, I'm pretty sure it's not gonna really convince anybody of anything that already has a position on this one way or the other. But that's some of my thoughts on this comment. So hope that at least anyway, hope there was some benefit to this discussion. But if not, it's the best I could do.